The European Union and the United States share the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world by a pretty significant margin. When counted collectively, the nations that make up these two economic blocs traded almost $2 trillion worth of goods and services back and forth between one another, beating out what most people think of first when they think of US trade relations, which is China. Europe's, and specifically the European Union's, collective trade with the US is also more intense than their collective trade with China, or even the US's trade with their direct land neighbours Canada and Mexico. What's more is that this trade relationship is surprisingly balanced. When the full picture is considered, they are each sending out roughly the same as they're getting back from across the Atlantic, which should make this relationship a bit more of a win-win. Now, maybe this is obvious. If they are counted as a whole, these two economies are the largest in the world, and beyond just the numbers alone, even if they might not like to admit it, they share a similar culture and business, law and life, which makes this trade a lot easier. But of course, that has been reconsidered significantly over the last 12 months as the USA has implemented several rounds of tariffs, as well as direct threats against EU members for some combination of reasons ranging from protecting their own industries to pushing questionable geopolitical goals, all the way down to providing news cover over a certain set of documents. Regardless of what the true motivation behind these tariffs and heated rhetoric is, economists have overwhelmingly pointed out the risks they pose to the American economy, but unfortunately for Europe, given their strong trade ties, the risk to them is almost as great, and unfortunately, they seem to have very little control over it. This has logically led to the countries that make up this group reconsidering just how dependent they are on this increasingly erratic power, and how dependent they really want to be in the future. So, it's worth exploring just how capable they are of severing this connection, and if and when they need to, what sacrifices would need to be made to do it. Cutting off or even just shrinking down this relationship would be one of the biggest economic events in history. And what's more is that it would be difficult at the best of times. But unfortunately for Europe, it hasn't exactly been having the best of times to begin with. Most of its major economies are dealing with a long list of their own problems. Undertaking such a dramatic trade shake-up right now might be like trying to climb Mount Everest while on life support. Now that alone is a big issue, but it's also not a unique issue. Europe is just the canary in the coal mine of a much wider shift in geopolitics as well. Over the last decade in particular, the world has slowly been dividing into two camps. The West centred around the financial systems and the military protection of the USA, and the BRICS, plus the outcasts, informally centred around the industrial might of China. The fact that both of these team captains are now coming with so much geopolitical baggage is raising the question of why these middle powers don't just work with one another to prevent being bullied by the wild whims of either of these two countries. It sounds great, but would it even be possible without untenable economic sacrifices for normal people? Now, if all of that wasn't enough to consider, it's also important to look at this issue with the context that in 3 years or 10 months or even just one too many hamburgers, it might not even matter anymore. So, would it even be possible for Europe and the other global middle powers to become independent of countries like the USA and China? What kind of sacrifices would it take to get there? Would it happen within a realistic time frame? And while we're at it, what does this mean for countries left in the middle? Not looking at anybody specifically, but I am looking specifically at the UK. With so much business news in today's media landscape, where do you find the stories about offbeat startups, under-the-radar trends, and unconventional business models that are actually interesting? That is exactly what The Hustle covers. It's a free daily email that makes business news actually interesting to read. It includes everything from market updates to interesting economic articles like this one about why you always see lawyers on billboards. It's fast and punchy and gives you all the information without having the feeling of being bogged down by long stories. I started reading it daily, and now I look forward to it showing up in my inbox. If you're starting a company or just want to see what ideas are gaining traction in today's economy, hit the link in the description, subscribe to The Hustle. Definitely worth checking out. To understand Europe's apparent reliance on its partner across the pond, we have to understand how it got here. The history of today's transatlantic economic partnership was no accident. It was a deliberate geopolitical relationship developed in the wake of World War II to counter the rise of communism and the growing influence of the Soviet Union. Economically, this relationship was forged with the Marshall Plan in 1948, through which the United States provided $13 billion in economic aid to its war-torn friends and former adversaries in Europe. The plan was simple. The United States would supply funding to European countries devastated by war to rebuild private industry and public infrastructure, restore production, and revitalise consumption. In his speech, General George Marshall emphasised that this was a mutually beneficial relationship, that the consequences of the war to the economy of the United States should be apparent to all. As such, the plan came with conditions. This was no charity. Participating countries had to agree to develop multilateral payment systems and trade within Europe, move towards currency convertibility, ease restrictions on imports from and increase exports to the United States. It also came with additional intended consequences, including flooding the European continent with US dollars to purchase US goods, solidifying the dollar's role in global trade, and providing nations with the economic growth and stability so desperately needed to ensure political stability, effectively tossing water on the simmering communist influences across Western Europe. Needless to say, the plan worked. In total, 16 countries accepted funds from the Marshall Plan, most notably Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Europe would enter its fastest period of economic growth in history, and by 1950, all of the participating countries had returned to or exceeded their pre-war industrial production. But the plan accomplished more than that. The foundation of transatlantic relationships that would lead to NATO and a starting framework for what would ultimately become the European Union had been set. America's post-war plan had paid off. What started as a simple industrial revitalisation plan would ultimately morph into a complex web of shared economic and geopolitical interests centred on the United States. The balance of geopolitical power and influence in the world had firmly shifted in the direction of America. And like it or not, Europe had a new big brother. For decades, Europe was happy to thrive in the shadow of their American friends, content in their shared prosperity and comfortable in their promise of mutual defence. But, like many relationships do, these partners have seemingly hit a rocky patch, and Europe's contentment has left it with a dependency that is now being put to the test. Will these allies find a way to navigate this tumultuous period and hold on to the security and stability they have come to know over the past 70 years? Or will Europe have to reimagine its role in the relationship? More on that later. First, let's explore how codependent this relationship truly is. To understand how a change in dynamics might look and how painful it might be, we first need to explore how complex it really is. While China remains the world's largest aggregate exporter, the United States and the European Union have the largest multilateral trade relationship, adding up to almost $2 trillion worth of goods and services moving across the Atlantic annually. For context, the European Union exports over $545 billion US goods to the United States, more than doubling their total exports to China. And they are on the receiving end of $365 billion US in goods from the United States, second only to imports from China. The EU's biggest exports to the US are heavy, high-end machinery, pharmaceuticals, and cars, and their biggest imports are machinery, mainly computers and telephones, minerals, mainly petroleum-based energy products, and chemicals. These partners aren't trading for fun. They are trading some of the foundational products that help their economies and societies run. American factories rely on precision German machinery to function, and much of the country's most popular breakthrough medications come from Denmark. Europe, on the other hand, is heavily dependent on energy from the US, particularly LNG, and finished tech products. Now, if we pause and do some quick math, you will see the underlying crux of the United States' current argument, that they are running a massive trade deficit with the European Union. In the eyes of certain politicians, this is implicit proof that in this relationship, Europe is selling more to the United States than they are buying. The scales of the relationship are not equal and Europe is winning. But things are not always as they seem. Earlier we mentioned that the trade between the United States and Europe amounted to nearly $2 trillion of goods and services. But the trade deficit headlines you see seem only to point to the value of physical goods trading between the continents, those products travelling across the Atlantic in tightly packed container ships. In this instance, politicians are not wrong. A deficit certainly exists. But what is conveniently missing is services. Unsurprisingly, the United States is one of the world's largest providers of services. It is home to Silicon Valley and the largest tech companies in the world, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Meta, as well as Wall Street and the finance titans of JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the New York Stock Exchange. When you factor in this trade of services, or non-physical products, technological and software licensing fees, intellectual property, digital advertising, and financial services, the math changes quite dramatically. While the headline trade deficit of goods may look scary, when it comes to services, the dynamic is flipped. The EU has a services trade deficit of over $100 billion from the United States. Viewed holistically, the trade numbers are relatively balanced and become a lot more palatable. Sounds like a win-win. Europe provides the high-end machinery, and in return, the US provides the high-end tech and financial services. Ideally, this is how globalization is supposed to work. Countries lean into their comparative advantage, specialising in the particular goods and services they are best at, and trading them for products and services other countries are best at. However, the dynamic has shifted. COVID exposed the supply chain vulnerabilities of many countries, and geopolitical tensions are rising. The world once focused on globalization is becoming more insular and is focusing on building and protecting domestic industries. For politicians eager to push this particular agenda, it's no wonder the trade conversation remains focused on goods. After all, they are tangible and it is easy to understand, but more importantly, it fits the narrative. And one could argue that services can be replicated and replaced, even more so today than ever before with the technological progress of AI, but you can't exactly vibe code away your reliance on liquefied natural gas. hence why the US feels it has the upper hand. So far, we've only touched on the actual goods and services flowing between the two trading partners. What accompanies that trade, however, is investment, commonly referred to as foreign direct investment flows. The European Union-United States investment relationship is the largest in the world and accounts for nearly 2/3 of all foreign investment in the US. Nowadays, the global economic system is truly global. The European companies that sell to America aren't just transporting goods across the Atlantic, they are investing real dollars into building factories and business hubs on the continent. Over 3 million US jobs are directly supported by EU investment, and the relationship goes both ways. Europe remains the favoured destination for US investment flows despite the narrative that money is flowing to low-cost countries such as Brazil, India and China. In total, Europe accounts for 2/3 of all US foreign investment over the last decade. This is more than a trade relationship. The EU and US commerce relationship includes cross-border investments, international jobs, mixed markets, and shared consumers. And of course, there is the financial system that makes all of this possible: SWIFT. Formerly known as the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT is the global infrastructure that provides secure, standardised communication between the world's financial institutions, effectively facilitating the send and receive instructions for cross-border payments. As you might imagine, SWIFT is essentially the financial nervous system of the globalised economy that we are. While based in Brussels, the keys to SWIFT are held firmly by the US because of the primacy of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Since the majority of global trade is denominated in US dollars, almost every international transaction eventually interacts with the US financial system. A vast majority of SWIFT transactions are cleared through US banks. This gives the US extreme influence over the financial system of the world. If the US decides to sanction a bank company or country, it comes with the implicit threat that any entity doing business with said company or country will be cut off. As such, SWIFT essentially becomes a de facto accomplice, cutting off system access for the sanctioned entity to avoid losing access to the dollar market themselves. Once banned from SWIFT, an entity is essentially locked out of its ability to transact with the rest of the world. The ability to receive payments, extend credit, transfer funds, and settle obligations is frozen, effectively paralysing the economic activity of the sanctioned entity. This was one of the most powerful tools used by the West against Russia following the war in Ukraine, with devastating effect. As you might surmise, in the current climate, the implications of US influence and EU reliance on SWIFT is profound. As long as Europe remains reliant on an infrastructure that is under the thumb of the US Treasury, they must walk a delicate tightrope. Trade is increasingly becoming weaponised on the geopolitical stage, and the US is throwing its weight. But how much negotiating power can the EU have against the country that controls their access to international commerce? To truly reach independence, the EU will have to contemplate creating a financial infrastructure that doesn't require a sign-off from Washington every time euros leave the continent. They wouldn't be the first. BRICS-Pay is, well, the BRICS nations' attempt at securing their own cross-border payment system. China has CIPS, and Russia has developed their version, the SPFS. All attempts by non-Western countries to insulate themselves from the whims of the US. For context though, the Russian SPFS partners with 124 financial institutions across 24 countries. SWIFT connects more than 11,000 banks worldwide, and the coordination of intercontinental exchanges is not an easy lift. Developing a European version of SWIFT is no simple task. It's an ambitious goal, but it also risks catching the ire of the US, making an already tentative situation worse. Who knows? Maybe advances in crypto and blockchain will eventually open alternative avenues for international commerce that water down the world's reliance on SWIFT, including Europe's. Only time will tell. For now, it remains a proverbial ace up the American sleeve. More aware now than ever before of their dependence on the US and their seeming lack of bargaining chips, the EU hasn't been sitting idly by. They have spent the last year attempting to diversify. In January, the EU and the major economies of Latin America signed the EU-Mercosur agreement, paving the way for free trade between the 27 member states of the EU, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay. 25 years in the making, the EU finally signed the dotted line, presumably all the more willingly as the burden of their newly protectionist partners in America ramp up tariffs and threaten more. The agreement creates a new open trading zone among two of the largest trading blocs in the world, encompassing more than 700 million people and valued at over 111 billion euros. Notably excluded are America and China, and Europe isn't the only middle power trying to find their way in this new world. Across the Pacific, plus the UK, exists the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnerships, or CPTPP, a 12-nation free trading bloc that includes Japan, Australia, Canada and the UK. Together, these nations represent the world's fourth largest free trading zone that includes 14.4% of global GDP and 7.7% of the world's population. As the leaders of world trade start to look inward, interest in these middle power blocks is continuing to grow. In 2026, reports indicate that the EU is interested in exploring an economic alliance with the CPTPP, and Canada has been quite open about their willingness to help make it happen. If successful, nearly 40 nations and more than 1.5 billion people would come together in a single free trade agreement, absent of American and Chinese influence. So, let's say Europe does decide it's time to regain some independence and stand more strongly on their own. They shift away from America and try to lean into these new Latin American and Pacific alliances. Who gets hit the worst? Remember, when we talk about the European Union, we are actually talking about 27 independent member states. And while a break would undoubtedly prove painful for all, the share of trade and economic production amongst the continent is not spread evenly, and neither would be the burden. The short answer is Germany. While it sits firmly in its position as the economic hub of Europe, its position in this hypothetical separation would be precarious. In fact, Germany is the world's third largest exporter, following China and the United States. This is not unique to its relationship with the US. The German economy is highly dependent on exports, with nearly 50% of its manufactured goods being sent abroad. It also happens to be the single largest exporter to the United States, a delicate position to be in should the relationship go south. In total, Germany exports more than $180 billion in goods to the US annually, more than 10% of its total trade, importing half that in return. As such, their economic industry is a lot more reliant on the US than the US is on Germany. The German economic system adds to the problem. Known for its Mittelstand, the backbone of German industry is a collection of small to medium enterprises that dominate the global industry of the country. They are highly specialised companies, often focused on a single niche product like high-end precision machinery. Coincidentally, high-end machinery happens to be the primary exports to, you guessed it, the United States, followed closely by cars. Germany's specialised manufacturing industry is its greatest strength, accounting for nearly 20% of its GDP. But in the case of potential trade war or sudden separation, it may turn out to be one of its greatest vulnerabilities. The German Mittelstand functions so well because of its access to the global markets and in particular to American customers. The closing of those doors would lead to unemployment, a drastic drop in GDP, and a scramble to find new trading partners. Not to mention a sudden shortage of the energy and high-end pharmaceuticals that they rely on sourcing from the US. While most exposed, Germany isn't alone. The United States and Ireland have a long history of shared social and economic ties. Nearly 1 in 10 US citizens is of Irish descent. In fact, the city of Boston, Massachusetts is recognised as the most Irish city in the world outside of Ireland. But the relationship between the countries doesn't end at their shared heritage. The two nations have a long history of strong economic partnership. The United States is Ireland's largest trading partner by a wide margin, accounting for nearly 1/3 of all Irish exports. Taking services into account, nearly 40% of Irish imports come from America. Because of its pro-business policies, low corporate tax rate, English-speaking workforce and access to the European Union, Ireland has become America's economic foothold on the continent. As such, much of America's pharmaceutical and tech industries begin their European escapades in the Irish Isles. Because of this unique dynamic, the US is the largest source of foreign investment in Ireland and a prime driver of its economy. But Ireland is no slouch in the relationship and is itself the 5th largest source of foreign investment in the United States. 781 Irish companies have operations in the US and employ more than 200,000 Americans across all 50 states. For America's investment, nearly 1,000 US companies have operations in Ireland, directly employing 245,000 people and indirectly employing another 169,000. While the number of companies and employees each nation supports in each other's respective economies is relatively equal, the economic impact is not. For perspective, the population of the United States is north of 340 million, while the population of Ireland is closer to 5.5 million, significantly less than the population of New York City. In total, US investment in Ireland accounts for nearly 15% of the total workforce, but it's more complicated than that. The majority of Irish imports from the US are intermediate goods and services, intellectual property and R&D services that enable the production of finished goods such as high-end medications. These are primarily intended for export elsewhere, including back to the US. This means many of the Irish employed by US companies find themselves working in the high-end industries of pharma and tech, and in turn they are some of the country's highest paid citizens. While Ireland's economy and exports look strong on paper, much of it is essentially a pass-through for American multinational enterprises, masking the country's true reliance on its relationship with the US. While precarious in the scenario we are exploring, Ireland does reap rewards for its role, in jobs, higher wages, and as a result, a higher tax base, from the employees, but more importantly, from the corporations. Every year, a significant portion of US company profits are recorded in Ireland, accounting for a large and growing portion of Irish corporate tax receipts. While beneficial in the current arrangement, reliance on US multinational corporations to fund fiscal obligations poses a real challenge for the country should relationship dynamics fray. A breakup with the US would mean a large spike in unemployment and a sudden drastic swing from the budgetary surplus to deficit. The economy of Ireland would need to structurally change in order to rebound. No easy task. And it doesn't end there either. While Germany and Ireland are two prominent examples, the effects of a breakup or trade war with the United States would ripple throughout the continent. The problem is, right now, Europe needs the US more than the US needs Europe. The US accounts for more than a quarter of the EU's gas imports, a problem heightened by the ban on Russian imports. But Europe is learning the hard way that trading reliance on one country for another comes with a cost. And the US remains the largest advanced consumer market in the world. This is the core of the current US administration's argument. If you want access to our customers, you need to pay a fee. Who actually pays that fee is still up for debate. But back to the point, under the current administration, the US is already aggressively trying to bring industrial manufacturing back home. Companies are being pushed to invest domestically through a combination of tax incentives and mounting political pressure. And while the US relies on Europe for specialised machinery and US corporations enjoy tax loopholes of countries like Ireland, these aren't make or break issues for the United States. America has the means to invest in and build a specialised manufacturing sector, and US companies can always operate from home, albeit at a higher tax rate. Europe, on the other hand, doesn't have that same luxury. Their high-end industries rely on the American customers, and there are a few other markets to turn to sell their goods. India is largely focused on low-end production, China is similar and is a competitor that has its own geopolitical baggage that comes with it, and Russia is effectively off-limits. There simply isn't a high demand for advanced machinery and high-end pharmaceutical development in the rest of the developing world. Also, Europe isn't just buying stuff from America. The relationship has led to increased efficiency for all, as countries are able to leverage trade, shared technology and labour to reach economies of scale and specialisation that they otherwise could not. But the problem for Europe is that much of the modern world's tech innovations are born in the United States. A clean cut would mean rebuilding the American tech stack from scratch, at a time when many EU countries are running into debt and deficit problems, among other things. So, all in all, it's pretty clear that a voluntary clean cut is not probable, if not impossible, unless economic catastrophe is what you had in mind. A more realistic transition would be a slow, still painful process and would lead to bouts of higher prices, lower productivity, and a major step backwards on the technological front. What is also clear, at least to European leaders, is that they do need to decrease their dependence on America and move towards a more self-reliant stance in the world, a de-risking of sorts, and that the transition needs to start now, and it is. In January, President von der Leyen of the European Commission delivered a special address at the World Economic Forum in Davos. In it, she made her clear case for a new Europe, calling the seismic change we are going through today an opportunity, in fact a necessity, to build a new form of European independence. She spoke of her vision to reposition Europe's role in the world as a global diversified trading partner and initiatives to make the EU less bureaucratic and more business-friendly. She's not alone. European leaders are becoming increasingly self-aware of their vulnerabilities, and comfort in the status quo is no longer a luxury. For over 80 years, Europe has enjoyed their implicit promise of protection from the United States and its massive military budget. Another point of contention for the current US administration that claims Europe has been catching a free ride off of US defence spending. On this point, Trump has been successful. For the first time in years, Europe has begun a massive remilitarisation effort, partially due to pressure from the United States and partially as a response to renewed Russian aggression. The problem is that reaching NATO's defence spending targets is a heavy lift for many of the stagnating and deficit-fueled economies of Europe. Balancing current budgets and stimulating economic growth is already proving hard enough as is. On one hand, there is something to be said for charging up the industrial base with domestic defence spending, particularly when you are trying to fuel job growth and high-tech industries at home. The problem is, military spending as stimulus is highly inefficient. It is spent money that provides no downstream economic benefit. It doesn't help the economy actually grow beyond the single products produced, particularly problematic for countries that are being pressed to maximise every available euro. On the other hand, it's not really up for debate. The United States is downplaying the importance of NATO and is suddenly saber-rattling over annexing Greenland, with threats of trade war and force. While war is highly improbable, what could Europe actually do? A hot or even cold war over Greenland would be disastrous. Europe could lose access to swift and international commerce, military protection, and $2 trillion of trade all at once. If it wasn't clear before, it is now. Power politics are back on the table, and some in Europe are not content with remaining powerless. French President Macron made that quite clear in recent speeches, telling the Munich Security Council that Europe has to learn to become a geopolitical power, and chose to recently re-emphasise his point with words and visuals as he delivered a powerful speech announcing a new era of France's role in Europe as the only nuclear power in the EU and as the primary provider of nuclear deterrence. France plans to increase the country's nuclear arsenal for the first time in modern history, and to deploy nuclear weapons in allied countries across the continent. With a Triomphant-class ballistic missile submarine as his backdrop, Macron stated boldly that, to be free, we have to be feared. He is not alone, with his sentiment being echoed by other leaders, and Europe's transitional efforts are growing beyond its military. Von der Leyen has called for a stronger single EU market. Governments are pushing their public officials off of American communication platforms, working to diversify their energy suppliers, invest in European-based AI initiatives, and develop non-US-based payment processing platforms. The slow shift has officially started. Times have changed, and Europe is deliberately choosing to strengthen itself as a bloc, to establish power and to claim its seat at the table. They are refusing to be reclassed as a middle power in this shifting world order. After all, they have had a front row seat to watch what it means when that happens. Their once-upon-a-time partner, the UK, left the European Union focused on a newfound ability to negotiate its own trade deals in 2020, right as the world began to turn more insular. Talk about timing. Beyond the direct economic ramifications of leaving the EU, the UK has essentially stepped off their team to go it alone, in a game of power brokering that favours collective bargaining. While the EU has the collective weight of its member states to push back on American tariffs, the UK must negotiate one-on-one. And the chips are not stacked in their favour. There is no debate over who is the junior partner in a UK-US relationship. They did join the Pacific-based CPTPP trade agreement, but that is proving to be more symbolic than anything. The UK finds itself alone on an island in a world of consolidating power blocks, and it is starting to regret it. The British public and politicians miss the EU and are working for a reset in the relationship, but it's off to a shaky start. Will Britain prove to be the first casualty of this new world order, or will they find a way to forge on independently, or with new or old partners? Only time will tell. Speaking of time, a lot of what's happening right now is the result of the current US administration. Will any of this even matter in 3 years? As economists, we like to pretend we are better than politics, but inevitably one has an influence on another, and in this case, it's pretty clear that politics has changed this economic relationship. The current era of trade wars, tariffs, and threats aren't the wishes of most Americans. They are the prerogative of President Trump and his cabinet, and with his party in power, that prerogative has met little effective political resistance. For now. It is increasingly looking like the administration may lose a lot of power in the upcoming 2026 midterm elections, as voters struggle with tariffs, affordability, and the war in Iran. But nothing is truly known. If anyone can defy the polls, it's Donald Trump. However, the US political system often functions like a pendulum, reactionarily swinging from one political spectrum to the other every few years. After all, a president can only serve 2 terms, right? Bold steps towards independence from the EU, the remilitarisation, energy diversification, the development of homegrown tech and payment infrastructure, and the new Mercosur Free Trade Agreement will likely take years to pay off. And the reality is that by the time these efforts come to fruition, the US will, ideally, have a new administration and may very well want to be best friends again. But the die has been cast, and Europe has had a glimpse of what their worst nightmares could entail. In a world of escalating geopolitical tensions, Europe can no longer, and should no longer, assume that the United States will always be there for them. Hopefully the relationship will improve, but either way, if Europe can successfully establish itself as a more independent bloc and step into their role as a global power, they will be able to approach their relationships as equal, not junior partners. For the middle powers currently caught in this shifting global landscape, the lesson is clear. The status quo is no longer guaranteed, and dependency has become a liability. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.